Welcome to the Polgar Chess University. In this lesson, I'd like to share with you two very distinct, in some ways, but similar in others, examples from relatively recent Grandmaster practice. The first game is played on the winning side by Alexei Shirov, who is known to be brilliant in very complicated wild positions. And the second was won by no other than former world champion Vladimir Kramnik, who is also known for his expertise when it comes to endgames and strategy. What's common between the two examples is finding that critical moment when there is some tactical opportunity that leads to the change in circumstances in the position, and it changes the direction of the game. Well, let's get started with the first example, which is a game played by Alexei Shirov on the black side, and his opponent was the Dutch Grandmaster Van Wely. In this position, that was reached after White's 25th move, it's Black's turn, and first of all I suggest you take a little bit of time and get to know the position and see what you would do if it was your game and it's your turn as Black. Well, it's a very interesting position, and we see that the Black pawn is on d4, and it's clear that that will be a key element in the game. That pawn may become a strong pass pawn, it may become a weakness, or we may give up that pawn in order to accomplish other goals. So, in this very position, Shirov felt that the best option is to immediately use the momentum and push that pawn ahead, opening the diagonal of the long diagonal of the bishop on g7, in view that if now White captures that pawn on d3, the pawn on h3 will be hanging as well. However, let's just go back to the starting position here for a moment and mention the fact that Black's knight on h5 in some cases may come real handy in the attack on the king's side. At the other hand, it is a crossroad that we're at right now, because the other option was to simply try to retreat that knight to f6 to a more central position, and then later try to perhaps relocate it d7 to e5 and play that way. Some of our silicon friends prefer this approach. However, let's go back to the game and see what happened after Shirov's ambitious d3 move immediately. His opponent indeed captured the pawn, and now the Black bishop captured on h3. I personally like this approach because it's a nice view that when White has played already g3, and with that in a way weakened the light squares around the White king, and when we don't see a bishop like White's bishop on d3 on that g2 square, then it's certainly a good sign for Black, who still has both his bishops on the board. Black has the pair of bishops, and it's clear that White's king's side is not ideally guarded, especially not on the light squares. So this is another critical moment in this game, where here White chose the wrong path. White should have played immediately knight c4 in this position, aiming towards the outpost on d6 for the knight. At that stage, Black would choose between playing bishop g4 immediately or retreating the knight to f6, and of course the fight would be still ahead. White here instead played a tactical move, playing e5. It looks like a good-looking move because if now Black captures that pawn with the bishop by taking, then white would immediately pin that bishop, and black would get into serious trouble, even though they wouldn't lose the bishop, but they would certainly get in a difficult position. So black did not capture, but found a much better move in this position in focusing on the king side attack. As we can see, the diagonal on which the black queen is on at the moment is all guarded by enemy pieces. So that's why black moved his queen to d7, put it on a neighboring diagonal from which the queen will have an open route to g4 towards white's king. At the same time, black is gaining the momentum while attacking the bishop on d3. White immediately responded with knight e4, which seems like everything is going according to white's plan. The outpost on d6 has been nicely supported by both white pawns on the 5th rank, and with white's last move, white also protected the hanging bishop on d3. And now the game gets real interesting. Black plays knight f4. Again, you can feel the energy in black's position, how the black pieces cooperate with each other real nicely. With black's last move, black attacks white's bishop on d3, which pretty much is in a pin. If the bishop would move away, white would lose the rook on d1. Even if the bishop would move to e2 right now, black would simply capture that bishop with a check, and then the rook on d1. Capturing the knight on f4 would be pretty much suicidal too, because of the immediate check, when the only way to avoid the immediate checkmate is to block the check with a knight. And then after queen f3, black again threatens to checkmate on g2, and the only way that white can guard that square and avoid the immediate checkmate is by moving the bishop from d3, but that will result in losing the rook on d1. So let's go back again and look at the position after black's last move, knight f4. White's only move is to indeed occupy the outpost with a knight on d6, which is indeed a very nice looking square for a knight, which by the way also protects the bishop on d3. And now black has a little bit of a dilemma how to continue. It's true that the knight on f4 is not in a real danger, at least for the moment, because if white would capture the knight, black would play queen g4 and checkmate. So the question is what to do next. Black certainly would like to get his queen to h3 to get closer to white's king. However, the black bishop occupies that square for the moment. And that explains black's next move, moving the bishop. Black moved the bishop to g2 to open up the h3 square for the black queen. But let's check for a moment another option that black could have considered, and that is to move to g4, a move that also attacks the knight on f3. Its idea would be then, after bishop e4, which protects the knight, to give a check, and when the king moves out of the check, then play knight g5, trying to focus on the pin, and black would be somewhat better in this case as well. But let's continue with what Shirov chose to do, and that was to play bishop to g2, and the idea is to play queen h3 next. If in this position white would capture the knight on f4, black would do the same, capture white's knight on f3, and then white's king would be in major trouble. Let's check for a moment what would happen if right now white would play a tricky move, play e6, trying to create a discoordination between the black pieces. For example, if black would capture now back with the pawn, then the black queen for the moment would stay out of that diagonal. Or if the knight would capture back, then even worse, the white could capture black's bishop on g2. So relatively the best option black has is to take with the queen, and that's a good one. And now after bishop c4, still play queen h3, kind of ignoring the happenings on f7 because black has major threats to checkmate right away. And at this stage, after knight h2, which guards against the checkmate, black would play bishop f3, creating a checkmate threat on g2 for a change. And after bishop f1, which guards that, knight e2, trying to deflect the bishop. And after queen takes, bishop takes, bishop takes, and bishop takes rook, black again came out ahead, being up an exchange. Let's go back to this key position, where white's best choice is actually to already move the knight out of the attack, move it to h2, prepare against the upcoming queen h3, and now the black knight is hanging, and in fact it has to be careful where it goes, not to lose the bishop on g2. Therefore black now would capture on d3, for example queen d3, move the bishop back to d5, and white could hold things together by playing f4. The position would be quite complex still, but we can see how weak white is on the light squares. Of course, they certainly have some compensation by having an excellent knight on d6. So this would have been the best that white could have achieved after bishop g2. Instead, white chose to protect the knight with the bishop on e4, and now white was hoping that if black plays queen h3, threatening the checkmate, then they'll successfully protect themselves with knight h2, and for example bishop e4, queen e4, and white would be quite fine. However, black chose a different and better move by playing queen g4, going after that knight on f3. And this is a very difficult position. It seems that white is in major trouble, which to some degree they are, although they made things worse than it should have been. White in the game continued by playing rook to d4, which is a blunder, after which black wins pretty much right away. After bishop f3, black does not capture the bishop, but has an intermediate move, first check, a discovery, and win the rook on d4. King captured on h3, bishop captured on e5, and black's advantage is decisive. Black is up an exchange and a pawn. Of course, remember, white is unable to win even a pawn back by capturing the pawn on b7, because that would be answered by queen d7 fork, winning white's knight. So let's go back a tiny bit after the possession of bishop g2, bishop e4, and queen g4. There is a quite surprising move here that could have kept white much longer in the game and would have given some decent survivor chances still. That impressive move is to play knight g5. Now, if bishop takes bishop on e4, then that same knight from g5 would capture back on e4 and keep things going. Or, alternatively, if black captures on g5, then bishop takes, knight takes, king takes, bishop takes e5, and black is a pawn up, but we have double pawns on the g file, so of course white is still ahead. Moreover, that white at this point is able to try an interesting approach, playing knight f7. Now remember, the black rook is hanging on d8, so therefore the king cannot recapture on f7, and this is a sample variation to what could happen after queen takes d1, queen g6. Now if the bishop blocks the check, white can force a draw immediately with perpetual checks. So let's go back a little bit and see what happens if the king starts running towards f8. White captures the bishop, check, but the knight escapes on f3. Well, this is still an interesting position. Black could play rook d7, for example, to make sure to block future checks, with the idea that if now or at a later point the white queen captures on g5, black could trade queens and go after white's queenside pawns with the rook. Nevertheless, this is still not a completely clear situation, and certainly white would have had better chances surviving than they did in the actual game. Let's move on to a completely different scenario, totally different game, a lot more peaceful and strategic and involving maneuvering. Here is our next position, which as you can see is very different in characteristics than the previous Shirov game. In this game, Vladimir Kramnik had the white pieces, while the Russian Grandmaster Yevgeny Bareyev was on the black side of the board. Well, what's going on for now? We have material balance. Both kings are kind of in the middle, but that isn't a major issue when we have queens on the board. So the real question is, what should white do next? White has an opportunity that is possible because of a strategic element, and that's the road Kramnik chose. He played c5 using the momentum that the knight cannot just move away without losing the pawn on f7. Therefore, black is forced to trade the bishop for the knight on e5 and only then move the knight away. Well, we'll get back to that in a moment, but before we proceed with the actual game, I'd like to mention that white could have kept some advantage also by playing bishop f4 and keeping the tension on. This would also attack the pawn on f7 because it would create a hidden pin on the black knight, so black would need to do something about this. So let's see what happened in the actual game. c5. So as we said, black has only one choice right now, taking the knight, otherwise black would lose a pawn on f7, and the pawn captured back, and the knight moved away. Naturally, that knight now is aiming to an outpost, just like white did in the previous example. In this case, the knight is aiming to get to e7 and then to d5. If indeed black would simply make those two moves without white achieving anything else along the way, it would be no problems for black. In fact, it may be black who could think of trying to win the game. However, as you shall see, there are some things white have planned along the way not to make things as simple for black. White immediately activated his second rook from the side by playing rook h3, and after knight e7 responded with rook to f3, aiming immediately at that pawn on f7, which of course cannot move, because if it advances even 2 squares up, en passant will come and white will win a pawn. Now that rook attacks the pawn and black needs to protect it. Black could protect the pawn with either rook, which are the only ways to protect it, and black chose to protect it with the rook from the king's side, because if black would come with the other rook, surprisingly, the problem would be that it would leave the a5 square out of reach. Often it would enable the white bishop to come to d2 and a5 in later situations, for example playing rook d6 first, and then after knight d5, bishop d2, with ideas of bishop a5, causing black trouble. So it's understandable that black rather played rook h to f8 for that reason, and even here white played rook d6. This type of outpost, even for a rook, can be very powerful. It's not unusual that even when a rook is attacked by a minor piece like a knight or a bishop, in such situations, white would let the rook still stand there and let black capture that rook in order to get a protected passed pawn. Although I have to say it probably will not be the case in this particular situation, but there are many similar situations, especially with queens still on the board, wouldn't be unusual. In this particular case, if the black knight would try to go immediately to c8, the problem would be that black would lose a pawn right away because black's rook on f8 would find itself on an unprotected square. After rook d6, black played a5, a smart move. So after bishop d2, the pawn is protected, or black would be able to play even b4 as they perhaps planned in the game. Now, a very important element in situations when you have a clearly better strategical position, but you need to simply widen the battlefront. Create new targets, and that's exactly what Kramnik did with his next move. He played g5, a very important move. If black now plays knight f5, then as it so often happens in strategical battles, we have to involve tactics to get ahead. Here, Kramnik planned to sacrifice the exchange in order to create a passed pawn along the h file. And for example, if rook h8, then rook f6, rook h5, rook f7, and then the e pawn would become rather strong, marching down with the help of the rook and the bishop. After g5, black instead continued by trading on g5, and white took back, and the knight went to f5 now. If the knight was going to d5, white's plan is to play h6, and then black is in trouble because the rook is under attack, and if it leaves, then the pawn on f7 is falling. After bishop g5, as we said, the knight moved to f5, rook retreated for now, black played a4, b4. And here black played king c8, which some analysts considered the mistake, although I think even after the recommended rook h8, and for example rook doubles, rook af8, check, and king b8 move, white will come out ahead after relocating the bishop to d8, then to b6, and doubling the rooks along the 7th rank. Although it may have been surely a better defense for black anyway to play rook h8 here. Black played king c8 when the white rooks got to enter to black's territory along the d file. Take, take, and king b7. Now came a few moves of maneuvering, perhaps to gain time on the clock. King c3, improving the position of white's king. King e4, king b7, rook d1. White is not risking anything, the rook can come back and forth. King f4, rook c8, of course, white is not trading rooks. Rook c7, rook d3. And after these moves that was perhaps gaining time on the clock or for psychological reasons, white was ready for action for a brilliant move that actually decides the game. Try to think what that winning idea is, then come back and see if you got it right. And the answer is bishop f6, a brilliant move sacrificing the bishop. Let's see what would happen if black indeed accepts the sacrifice. Pawn takes, pawn takes. If rook c8, white would be ready to trade rooks, and then simply play king g5. King d7, h6. The black king is just a move too late. Take takes. e4. And in this moment, a very key element, the king has to move to h7, not to g7. And now king e6, king g7, and black is getting into zugzwang after e4, a3, or a3 and then f3, and the black king must leave, and then the pawn on f7 falls. Quite brilliant and beautiful. So let's go back to the point after bishop f6, where in other cases white could be threatening to trade to capture on g7, and after knight g7 push the h-pawn. Black in the game played g6, when the game ended real quick after the trade, and king g5 when black resigned. Quite a beautiful endgame by Kramnik. What's common between these two games that we saw? It is common that the winning side used the momentum, that it involves some tactics in order to achieve strategical gains. And finally, let's see the jewel of the week. Here we go. In this endgame, composed by Hegeman, black is up 2 rooks, and white only has 3 pawns as compensation. Okay, it's true, white can capture a rook immediately, but even that will leave black with a significant material advantage. However, white has an opportunity with a method similar to a windmill to achieve an immediate win. Good luck in finding the solution. And here is the answer. f5 check, and now instead of capturing the rook right away, check first, forcing the bishop to block, and only now to capture the rook. The difference is that now white threatens to checkmate on d2, so black doesn't have time to continue with what they would like to do, but need to move his bishop. When we give a second round of checks, followed by coming back to a different diagonal, yet again threatening checkmate, but also attacking the rook at the same time. Now black's situation is lost, even after the creative defense bishop d4, because white captures the rook, not the bishop, and then the 2 connected pass pawns simply prevail. Hope you enjoyed this beautiful endgame as well as the lesson, and be back for some more instruction next week. Bye bye until then.